With 10 different types of components, there's a lot of different combinations you can come up with, but which combination should you use for which scenarios? Let's go ahead and talk about that. Let's start off with the components that you'll be using the most, and those would be your PvP components, player versus player. The PvP components consist of high rate of fire, damage increase, damage decrease, as well as armor buff and weapon buff. And while these are called PvP components, they do have other uses, most notably alliance defense and individual defense. So these do have other uses, but they're largely nicknamed the PvP components. This gives you a great balance of survivability as well as damage dealing to get you through a fight. And of all 5 of these components, the high rate of fire is the most important. You'll want to level this up before any other component in the game. However, there is a slight variation to these PvP components. If you were going up against an opponent that you know has a higher high rate of fire than you, for example, if I was using a level 9 attacking someone with a level 10, that means my level 9 high rate of fire is literally doing nothing for me, so it should be replaced. Which brings us to the slightly varied PvP components. You'll still have the damage increase, damage decrease, as well as armor buff and weapon buff, but instead of high rate of fire, you should be using dex buff. What this is a dodge bonus. If your opponent has a higher high rate of fire than you, that means all 9 of their unit stacks are going to be able to attack before yours, which means you need some extra survivability to even get the option to attack back. And the dex buff gives you dodge. When your units successfully dodge an attack, it reduces the damage from that attack by 90%. So they can still hurt you, but it significantly reduces the damage and allows you to survive, or at least gives you the best chance of surviving all 9 of their attacks, so you get the chance to punch back. The next set of components we're going to go ahead and look at is the world boss components. Since the world boss does not hit very hard, we basically forego all survivability and go straight damage. So these components consist of weapon buff, damage increase, crit damage, crit buff, and hit. Now the reason we have hit on here is even if an opponent on their stats say they have a 0% chance to dodge, they still have a chance to dodge, so hit helps reduce that just a little bit more to eke out just a little bit more damage. Now, as most of you know, to trigger elemental explosions against the world boss, you do need 2 types of units. It's very common to see these standard world boss components on both types of units, and it works perfectly fine. However, I do want to bring up a variation that is occasionally used. Some people will use a varied world boss component setup consisting of weapon buff, damage increase, crit damage, crit buff, and instead of using hit, they use high rate of fire. What this allows them to do is pick and choose which unit is going to trigger the elemental explosion. So some people will put their off units in the back row, they'll give them high rate of fire, so they'll attack first, and then their main unit up front, taking advantage of the assault formation, will trigger the elemental explosion since they will attack after the off units. But either setup can be effective, it just depends on how you like to attack the world boss. These components are occasionally called PvE components, however, these are generally only used against the world boss because you forego all survivability, and it's very common to see the PvP components used against other PvE scenarios. So these are generally nicknamed the world boss components, foregoing all survivability and going straight damage. The last set of components we're going to go ahead and talk about is surprisingly the most complicated, but that would actually be the sandtable components. These components change significantly as you level up. Now, early on in the game, generally the components you're going to be using are the world boss components. So the weapon buff, damage increase, crit damage, crit buff, and hit. And the reason for this is the sandtable hits very hard. And early on in the game, you won't be able to survive these hits. They will likely take out your entire stack no matter what kind of survivability you have on. So it's very common to see the world boss components used at lower levels. Now, eventually people will notice, why do I use world boss components? My PvP components are doing more damage. It's kind of true. Eventually, you start to be able to survive a hit or two from the world boss. Your stack will make it through, so adding some survivability components actually starts to make sense and increases your damage. However, you don't want to use the standard PvP components, you want to use the varied PvP components. Since the sandtable has 0% attack speed, high rate of fire is unnecessary, so the variation to the PvP components is what you should be using. The weapon buff, armor buff, damage increase, damage decrease, as well as that dex buff to hopefully dodge some of his attacks and make it through more rounds. Once you get to the really high levels, then things start to get complicated and I don't really have a straight answer. So we'll flip over to the page that I have my components set to. Now, I am a Navy main, so eventually when you attack the sandtable, your march size will become so big that the units it gives to you will not fit against the sandtable. As you can see here, I can't fill up all my slots with navy. This is where the complication with the components kind of comes out, and you have to do some experimenting, and we're still trying to see what we can do. It really depends on how strong your other units are. So it's very common to attack the sand table with other units up front, kind of like this. Since I'm a navy main, it protects my navy the longest, and I use the other things as shields essentially, which affects the way I set up my components. The way that this affects my components is I put a lot more survivability on my army and air force, which are just there to absorb attacks, while I put more damage on my navy. So I'll walk you through what I'm currently doing. I usually only use one stack of air force, and the reason I'm using air force is I do have the golden plane. I have the golden plane, ship, and tank, so I take advantage of that. So I put one stack of planes, and I put everything survivability on there. Armor buff, dex buff, damage decrease, invulnerability, which reduces damage taken from crits. You rarely see this used, but I use it against the sand table. And since there is nothing else to really help with survivability, I go ahead and throw weapon a buff on there, so hopefully when my air force hits, it'll give me just a little bit more damage. Now my army is my secondary unit type. I'm a navy main, but army is my second strongest, so I also put some damage on this. Now I give it some survivability with the armor buff, the dex buff, damage decrease, but I also give it a damage increase and a weapon buff. High rate of fire is not important against the sand table, so I went for a balance on this one. And then moving to my navy, which is my main unit, and of course since it's in the back of the formation, it's the last one to get hit, and I'm almost to the point where my navy doesn't get hit at all. So I go more damaged focus on this. Damage increase, weapon buff, crit damage, crit buff, and armor buff for that little bit of survivability, since I still lose a stack or two of navy before finishing my sand table fight. So as you're leveling up in the game, the sand table fight is pretty easy because you can fit all one unit type. So these component setups that I mentioned earlier work very well. But eventually, once your march size starts to exceed the number of units that it gives you of a specific type, then you start doing some funky experiments, and this is the kind of stuff that I've been working with. I'm still trying to see if I can eke out a little bit more damage, but really what it comes down to is what kind of equipment you have attached to your units, what heroes you're using. Are they universal or are they just one unit type? So once you get to the end game, there's not a straight answer on what components to use against the sand table, which is also why I say the sand table is the most complicated for the component setups. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of something to work off of and some ideas that you can play with to see if you can up your damage against the sand table. Yes, I know my old sand table video does need to be updated. It will be coming out eventually. I don't know when, but it will come out. But let me know what you guys think of my component setups below. Do you use anything different, or are these pretty standard? Don't forget to leave a like. Thank you to everybody who's subscribed. You can also check out my Discord in the description below, as well as some of my other social medias, Twitter, Facebook, all those other cesspits. And as always, have a fantastic day.